Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Our guest today is Jerry Marzinsky, a past guest, a person who spent a lot of time in the mental health field in mental health institutions, in fact, the largest one in the world at one time, as well as in the prison correction system in Arizona, where Jerry Marzinsky worked with a lot of psychiatric patients, but within the context of the prison system. So without any further ado, Jerry Marzinsky, welcome back to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
Well, it's good to be back again, James. As I spoke to you earlier, I have a series of actual patients I've worked with and some very interesting cases here that kind of point out what it's like for them to live with these voices that they're hearing, which in previous shows we talked about how we found that these things were not hallucinations as psychiatry says. And kind of to briefly go back and pick up a little bit from back there, while at the state hospital, after 7 years, I saw that these voices ran patterns. And they were not random like hallucinations. They were consistently negative, derogatory, and nasty. And the pattern was always apparently to upset the patient as much as possible. I was told that by psychiatry and by graduate school that these voices were caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain of the patient. And I believed that. I never had any reason to doubt that until I saw that psychiatry was not giving any labs. They were giving no tests whatsoever to measure any kind of chemical brain imbalance in the brain of any of these patients to see what, if anything, was in balance. And you kind of go, okay, how do they know what's out of balance if they don't have any kind of test to show that? And they did not have any kind of test to show that. Matter of fact, they didn't have any evidence any substantial evidence to prove that what was happening with schizophrenics was a brain imbalance. You can't see it on MRIs, you can't see it in blood work. They can't detect it other than by the behavior they're seeing out of these patients. So it was kind of like, okay, if it's not caused by a chemical imbalance, what does cause this? And after asking all the staff, they weren't curious. I mean, I was like, okay, if these guys are hearing voices, why doesn't anybody want to know what the voices are saying? And, you ask them, well, they're all delusions, they're hallucinations, they don't make any sense. But nobody was asking. And so I'm like, I wanted to know what the voices were saying, because it appeared that, it was clear that when the voices were telling these people to kill themselves, which happens often, the psychiatrists would jump up like stuck pigs and put these guys on suicide watch, fill them full of drugs. I mean, those voices were very real at that point. And they reacted to them as if they were a real threat, and they would drug these people up and lock them up and keep them medicated until they kind of got over wanting to kill themselves. But in all other cases, they ignored what the voices were saying. So it's like, okay, what are these things? They were consistently negative. So to get at that, one of the biggest problems that I faced at the beginning, and it took kind of a few years to kind of figure out how to get over this, what we're dealing with here, and all this information I'm about to give today pertains only to paranoid schizophrenics. There's a lot of different types of schizophrenics. Paranoid schizophrenia is one of the biggest ones. It's one of the ones of most concern. It's one of the ones that results in the most violence. And it's one of the most prevalent ones all over the world. I have statistics somewhere, but in the United States, it's like 10 million people it affects, and their families, which multiplies that out, tremendously. So what these guys experience when they first encounter these voices. Now, what's important to understand is that these voices sound just like their own thoughts. I mean, they don't come through like, oh, yeah, like the Boogie Woogie Man. They sound just like their own thoughts. They hit people mostly who have been physically, sexually, and emotionally severely abused. So they're already depressed. They're already have a negative mindset. They're already transmitting negativity from the traumas that they've faced. And the voices they're like sharks that smell blood. You know, when they detect a big pool of negative emotional energy, you know, they're there to kind of fire it off the best they can. So people get hit with these most often around 25 years of age. So the individual might be trucking around, and, you know, going on with their lives, and they stub their toe. And all of a sudden a thought comes into their head that says, well, you stupid bastard, you couldn't even see that thing, you stubbed your toe, you know, and it sounds just like their own thought. And then later on, they might have lost something, you know, and it's like, then that thought comes in, well, you know, you're stupid and you're worthless, and it picks up from there. But it sounds like them talking to themselves. And then it grows in intensity. Now, sometimes they come on and they say, hey, we can help you out. There was one girl that she started hearing, they said, well, we can help you out on your exams. She was in college. And they told her all the answers to the exams. So she goes, hey, this is cool. So she thought they were friends until they slowly started turning negative on her. And I got called when her mother saw that she was considering suicide, and the voices were telling him to kill herself. So the voices can come on fast, they can come on slow. Amphetamine is one of the biggest things that brings them about. I mean, amphetamine just opens you up to infestation by these things like nothing else. I've seen more people go psychotic on amphetamines than any other drug. On the other hand, they don't like marijuana because it calms you down and you don't have a nasty withdrawal from it. They want drugs that feel good at first and then have a nasty, ugly withdrawal, and they will steer you toward those drugs and steer you away from marijuana. You know, I don't know how many times I talked to patients who said the voices didn't want them using marijuana. And I found that interesting. So as these voices increase in intensity, they start increasingly berating the person. And there was one patient I talked to where the voices came in and it was like they were trying to drive a new car. They would say, hey, go over there and pick up that pencil, you know, or, you know, turn around and walk through that door. Or it's kind of like they were trying to see how much the person would listen to what they had to say, how much control they had. It was like they were experimenting with a new vehicle or something, which I found interesting. Now that the rub comes is trying for the patient to figure out where these thoughts are coming from, if they're their own thoughts, and why this is happening. So as the voices begin increasing their control and tell them more horrible things about themselves, I mean, and it's always consistently negative. I mean, you would think hallucinations would be all over the place. They'd be positive, negative, neutral, everything in between. These are not. These run well-defined patterns, and they're repetitive patterns, they're predictable patterns. They are not random. The conversations that these people carry on with these voices are not word salad. It's not a bunch of you could have the Bob gobbledygook. These are complete sentences that they speak to them in. That's not broken. It's like they're speaking to an invisible entity in their heads, in their minds. At first, they don't know what's going on. They're very confused. They're very frightened. They don't know which thoughts are theirs and which thoughts are this coming in from the voices. Other than the voices are telling them vile things that they don't want to share with others. they they cause constant nightmares and attack these people 3, 4 in the morning. They do not want them to sleep, and that's part of weakening them so they will not resist their suggestions. So as these things increase, these people need somebody to speak to. So they think, okay, I'll speak to my friends, and they tell their friends about these strange voices that they're hearing and some of the nasty things they're saying, and their friends kind of back off and go, "Ooh, you're weird," or something's odd about you. This isn't right. And slowly they back off, think they're weird, think they're possessed, and that's the first blow they get with regard to trying to tell somebody about the voices. And it's a fairly negative experiences. And then the voices come in and go, "See, we told you that if you told anyone about us, that this would happen." And it's like it verifies what the voices told them in the first place. Right? So they've learned not to talk about the voices. There is no positive benefit for them to talk to anyone about the voices because it's caused them nothing but trouble and heartache, and nobody believes them anyway. Right? So they keep the voices to themselves. They isolate themselves because it's easier not to deal with people and try to figure out what's the voices, what's not the voices. And the voices are always telling them negative things about their friends, their family, any close relationship they have, because they want to break them away from those relationships and isolate them. And the patient feels more secure when they're isolated, because then they only have to deal with the voices and they don't have to deal with trying to figure out what's the voices and what's somebody else talking to them, or whether something that other person said was an insult, because these things get them to perceive reality in the worst possible way. It's like they put on dark sunglasses, and these people are already low on energy and depressed, and so they keep the voices to themselves. It's like a powder keg, and the voices grow stronger while they're in isolation because there's nobody to interfere or give this person support, and they try to drive off anybody who does try to help them and support them, and they do a pretty decent job on that. So this drags along. The voices kind of increase until they figure, well, I'm going to tell the last person in the world that I really trust about these things, and that's their parents. So they go and tell their parents, and the parents freak out. Oh my God, what is this? You're hearing voices? What? This isn't right. They don't know what to do about it. The patient usually is causing a lot of turmoil in the family. There's a lot of screaming matches, trying to drive the parents away. Finally, they drag the person to a psychiatrist. Right? So the patient at that point usually perceives being dragged to the psychiatrist as a stab in the back by their parents, because they don't want to go to any psychiatrist, and that's the last place the voices want them to go. So they feel that was a betrayal on the part of their parents, and the voices assure them it was. They go, well, yeah, you can't trust them either. So when they get to the psychiatrist's office, now in straightforward, non-technical terms, this is what they're told, by an esteemed member of the system. You have a mental illness. The voices you hear are hallucinations, even though they seem very real to the patient. They're being told they're hallucinations. They're not real, but to the patient, they're very real. And psychiatrists basically tell them nobody else hears these things. So you're the one who's mentally ill, because the rest of us don't hear these things. So they tell them, well, you have a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. This is what they're going to call you. And you're psychotic, and that means you're out of touch with reality as we see it. So here's the patient, goes into the psychiatrist's office, and he's been hit with all this. And then comes, what this means is you're insane, you're a lunatic, because basically they're telling him there is no other explanation for your constant hallucinatory experiences. Something is broken in your brain. So they tell him that there is no cure, that they have to take medications and very powerful toxic medications for life, and there is no other treatment. And in their eyes, there isn't. So, they go, well, the pharmaceutical industry has come up with some very effective medications that will suppress your voices, but they don't cure anything. I mean, they suppress the psychotic symptoms. So the patient's basically forced into taking these mind-numbing antipsychotic drugs with these side effects. Their breasts begin to grow, there's massive weight gain, blood pressure goes all over the place. They have seizures, the blood sugar goes out of control. With long-term use, there's something called tardive dyskinesia that takes place. It's an involuntary jerking of their muscles in their face and their tongue that they can't control at all. It'll spread throughout their entire system, where their hands are shaking, their body's shaking, and if it goes far enough, it lapses into what they called at the state hospital the Thorazine shuffle. So, the pharmaceutical industry has come up with something to counter that. And what's actually happening with these symptoms is there's a destruction of their peripheral nervous system. And if it goes on long enough, it's a permanent destruction. And their brain is being killed. They've recently have research showing that the brain cells die under the influence of these powerful drugs, and the brain starts to shrivel. So what they go is, never fear, we have something that'll take those side effects away. And they give them cogentin, which is, kind of gives them a high and is somewhat addictive, but it mellows them out so they can't experience these side effects too bad, these horrible side effects. So what the medications do is they calm the voices, and the voices don't like being calmed. What the voices do, and I didn't. It took me 7 years to come to this, is they will focus the patient's attention on the negative side effects of the antipsychotic drugs, and tell them, and these side effects weren't good, as you saw, and they'll tell them, the psychiatrist is poisoning you. Look at these side effects. You are being poisoned by your psychiatrist. You need to get off these drugs. And, they do. They go off those drugs in horrendous numbers. So the drugs at the time I was at the state hospital were the only thing to maintain their link to sanity. Otherwise, they were out there. They were unreachable. And psychosis is the worst nightmare. I mean, it's especially paranoid psychosis. It's got to be akin to going through war, being on the front lines. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible experience. But time after time, they stopped taking their drugs and they'd lapse back into this psychotic state as if they were doing it voluntarily. I found out after 7 years that it was the voices telling them not to take their medications because the medications were poison. And any psych staff knows that these people go off their medications constantly. And the reason they give is because of the side effects, the horrible side effects. So what I did is I decided, why choosing psychosis over the side effects is akin to choosing whether to get the flu or to whether to get the bubonic plague. I mean, that's the choice. One's bad, the other's much worse. And these guys were constantly choosing the bubonic plague. And I'm like, why? That makes no sense. It's against all survival issues. They can't function when they're psychotic. It's a nightmare. Why are they choosing the worst? And time after time, this went on for years, I would ask them, and they would say, because of the side effects of these medications. Well, okay, what's worse? And finally got to the point where I had them write down all the side effects of the medications that they experience, because they don't experience all of them, and then 2 or 3 pages of horrible psychotic symptoms. So I'd give them the first sheet and say, write down all the negative side effects you've experienced from your medications. All right, so they write down, 5 or 10. And I give them those 3 sheets of psychotic symptoms. I said, which of these have you experienced when you went off your meds? And it was like a bunch of them circled, and they were all horrible. And when they finished that, I would give them the 2 sheets and I would say, which is worst? Consistently, they'd go, well, yeah, the psychosis is worst. Then it'd be like, okay, so then why do you keep stopping your medications? And some of them have stopped taking medications over and over again for 8, 10 times. And they would say, I don't know. And that went on for years. I don't know. Until one day, 7 years after I'd been in the state hospital, one patient admitted that the voices told her that she was being poisoned and to stop taking her meds. Now, along with this is the high assault rate upon psychiatrists at the state hospital. I mean, that was one. They had a higher assault rate, 3 times that of any other medical staff anywhere. And this is pretty consistent around different institutions. Psychotics would assault them at a rate, even though they spent a small fraction of the amount of time with these patients that other medical staff did, they would be assaulted at a rate 3 times higher than any other doctor or professional staff, psychologists, psych nurses, anybody else, which was very interesting, because the voices didn't like their drugs, and they were the ones that were prescribing them. So, by the time these guys got to me, they've been through these traumatic experiences and had been locked up a number of times for going off their meds. And here I come along and go, hey, I'm the new psych on the unit. Tell me about your voices. It's like, you can tell what they're thinking. Whoa, I'm not telling you about nothing, especially since I was charged with making sure that they stayed on their voices. And I was kind of like, stayed on their medications. And I was kind of like the watchdog, that if any of them went off their medications, I needed to note that and tell psychiatry. And they would be forced back on their meds again, or they would be discharged if they wouldn't go on them. So, what I'm dealing with here is paranoid schizophrenics, and they are paranoid, and this is a huge barrier to reaching them. And it took years to learn how to get past that, especially in the position I was in. So, after getting out of the state hospital, where I realized these things were, I guess I was still resisting accepting for myself that these things were something other than the person, but I suspected it heavily. And I couldn't probe too hard at the state hospital or any of the hospitals, because when you start pushing to learn more about the voices get upset, and then the patient gets upset. So the state hospital, one of the cardinal rules was you do not upset psychiatric patients, and doesn't matter what. You don't upset them, because you never know what they're going to do. I mean, some of them can lapse into violence pretty quickly. So when psychiatry found out that I was asking them about the voices, I was reprimanded and ordered not to, because they were hallucinations. I should know that. And that all I was doing was upsetting the patients and making them worse. So twice I was ordered to stop asking questions about the voices, because they noted some of those patients got upset and didn't want to answer questions about their voices, and went and told the psychiatrist, oh, he's badgering me with questions. So I had to be real careful there. when I went to work in the psych department of the state prison, a complaint like that wouldn't even break the background noise. You know, any complaint by an inmate of a psych asking him questions about his voices, would, you know, that was small potatoes. That was, you know, that wasn't something to even consider. So I was able to get a lot more information from these people there, and also probe deeper into the voices and how they operated. So to get to the point where I reached these cases where I'm telling you about took years. You know, it took years before they could talk to me and trust me. Because, like, again, even in the prison, I was a watchdog. So one of the first guys I encountered was, you know, an inmate Sparger. He was a timid guy and willing to talk about his voices and tell me in real time what they were saying. Now, this was very rare out of the whole population of, and what happened is they closed down all the psychiatric hospitals all over the U.S., dumped these guys out on the street saying we're going to handle them in mental health clinics when they wouldn't even take their medications when they were being shoved down their throats under controlled conditions. They were expecting them to go to a mental health clinic and get antipsychotic medications. It's a joke. They don't do it. They're not going to do it. So they go out and they do stuff like what you're seeing, you know, shoot people. The voices are telling them, yeah, you got to kill these people. And a lot of these guys that do this stuff are psychotic. And society is reaping upon itself what it sowed. So, you know, Sparger was one of the first ones that I started working with in the prison setting, and was willing to tell me everything his voices were telling him in real time, which, like I said, was very rare. When I found one of these guys, and I always had a small group of them available that I was working intensely with, that to me, they were like gold mines. They were like nuggets, diamonds, because most of the inmate population did not want to talk about the voices they were hearing for obvious reasons. I mean, especially to a psych. So what was going on with him? He was a very highly paid stockbroker in New York on Wall Street, you know, making, you know, six-digit. I mean, he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. He was married and was using a lot of cocaine. And eventually the voices jumped in there while he was using the cocaine and amphetamine. And they got rooted in there. Now, this guy was mild-mannered. He came to a group, so, you know, for a paranoid schizophrenic to go to a group to try to get help was like a non-verbal, like, hey, you know, this guy wants some help, because they get paranoid around all these other people looking at them. So started working with him, and he said after like 15 years, he had hid the voices from his wife for 15 years. And I'm like, how the devil did you do that? And he said the voices were constantly telling him bad things about his wife, this is what they do when the patient has a spouse or a girlfriend or any other relative. They start telling them bad things about them, make them distrust them, and try to break that relationship. You know? So they were constantly telling him bad things about his wife, running her down. And finally, after some 15 years of you know, kind of keeping arm's length from her, she filed a divorce. And when she saw that he seemed, as well as his voices, seemed very relieved that he was getting out of that relationship, and she noticed that, she took him to the cleaner. She took everything. She took everything he had. So he ended up in New York City living out of garbage cans, you know, in some grotto somewhere in Central Park. He slept on newspapers, and the voices liked that, and he did too. You know, he didn't mind it at all. I mean, even though he was freezing, he was in the rain. He said, I always knew which restaurant trash cans to go dig into. It was a very simple life. I was by myself. I didn't have to worry about anything. The voices were keeping me company. I could talk to them. So, it's like, I'm like, why do you want to get rid of them? And he goes, well, I know they're destroying my life. So we worked for months, and what I was doing, basically, this is very simply, is telling him to do the opposite of everything the voices were telling him to do. And kind of try to get him on a positive spiritual path. And as he started working with those things, the voices started losing energy until they kind of one day, while in my office, they just screamed and disappeared. And I looked at him, and he looked like he was about to fall out of the chair. And he looked at me and he said, "The silence is deafening." So this is the first time in decades that the voices have been gone. And I told him what he needed to do to keep them gone. And he did that for a few weeks. Now, he was working in the prison's answering service for motor vehicle. So he was able to function in that capacity. And before I was transferred off that unit, I stopped by and asked him, I said, "How you doing? The voices still gone?" He said, "Well, they were gone for 2 months, but I got lonely, and he didn't have any friends. So he called them back, and they came back. And there he was, psychotic again. That's the way he wanted it. So here he was working on the phone lines, psychotic as a bed bug. Well, that's one story. You got any questions, James, or should I just keep trucking on?
Yeah, that was kind of a sad, outcome to that story, because I guess he just wasn't used to the deafening silence. And we hear this from some people and maybe they don't understand the dynamic of the intrusive thoughts, but when they're left to their own devices, when they're alone and they don't have someone to interact with, I guess either a combination of the deafening silence and or these intrusive voices, I can see how it could lead to self-medication, where they want to blot out all that, by drinking too much or imbibing in other drugs, substances, just to destroy thought. Jim Morrison of The Doors talked about how one of the reasons why he was such a hardcore alcoholic was it destroys thought, right? It just blots everything out. So, that's the first thing I thought about when you told me the story about that poor guy.
Well, you're exactly right there. They will use virtually anything to try to self-medicate, except the medications they're supposed to take. So what the voices do is go, these, and most, they have a hard time realizing that these things are not who they are, because they sound just like their thoughts.
Yeah.
So, they do. It's very disconcerting. It's very fearful. And some of the things that these voices tell them are very vile and ugly. And, they don't want to tell anybody about what they're saying. So, they do turn to any kind of drug. And the voices want them to use specific drugs, amphetamine being the number one. And they will tell, I've talked to many inmates that told me that the voices told them where to go to get amphetamine when they run out and what time to be there. And they showed up there, and somebody with amphetamine came by and gave it to them. And this was time after time after time after time. Now, along with that, the alcohol story, there's one story I had down here in the timeline here. A very violent, psychotic, drunken Apache. All right, here it is here. So they couldn't deal with him on the reservation. He was a big guy, and he was violent and a drunkard. And one day I got word that they were sending him to my unit, and I would be in charge of providing psych services for him. So I tracked him as he was coming in on the computer, on the prison system's computer. And this guy, usually inmates, before they get to our unit, they stop at Alhambra or one of the classification centers, or, you know, they're waylaid in between and evaluated. This guy just crashed straight through the system, and you could just see him, boom, Alhambra, boom, through, bang, 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 and he's on his way to my unit. I'm like, holy cow, how did he do that? How did he break through all these other blockages that they usually have? But he was coming. And so when he got there, I pulled him in, and, you know, what I heard was he was kind of like a evil Indian medicine man or a very bad skinwalker, but he worked in those realms, and he was pretty spooked by the other Indians were pretty spooked by him. So this was my chance to, I mean, the closest thing I would ever get to probably talking to a skinwalker or one of these kind of strange guys. So I called him into the psych department after he got there and said, okay, my name's Jerry. I'm going to be kind of watching over you psychologically from the time you get here. I'll be calling you in at least once a month just to check on you, see how you're doing with your meds, and if you're having any problems, and just kind of seeing how things are going for you here. See if we can arrange you for, you know, for some programs for you, and do something about your drinking. And he looked at me like I'd rather, you know, slit your gut, spill your intestines all over the floor than say another word to you. And I'm like, okay, you know, I'll see you next month. So I went to the head of the Native American inmate group on the yard, who was a very mellow Navajo fella, an elderly fella, who I liked a lot. I helped the natives get wood for their sweat lodges and their ceremonies and stuff like that. So I always had a good relationship with those guys. And I asked this guy, and what's with this Apache? You know, what's going on with him? And he said, you be very careful of him. And I went, oh, okay. So it took me probably 3 months before I could talk to that fella for 20 minutes. Without him getting angsty and feeling like he had to get out of there. And he started telling me about his battles with spirits, and all the spells he could cast, and these strange stories that kind of reminded me of some of the stuff Carlos Castaneda talked about. They were otherworldly stories where spirits were chasing him, and he was battling spirits, and he could see them, and you know, it was like a strange world, but it did smack of the Carlos Castaneda stuff. So finally one day I kind of took a risk and was telling me one of these stories. I asked him, I said, well, if you can do all this stuff and you can fight these spirits, why couldn't you stay sober? And man, I was holding my breath like, is this guy going to go off on me? And I'm kind of watching him closely. And he goes, I'll tell you why. Because of the spirits of dead alcoholics. And I'm like, you know, what do you mean? What spirit? He says, they can't get drunk unless they have a body to go into that's drinking. You know? So they're constantly trying to break in there because they can't get high in the spiritual form. They have to be in somebody's body to get their high again. And he told me about a bar in Phoenix where these alcoholic drunk spirits were piled up so high over that bar that they disappeared into the sky. And you know, every time he walked by that bar, he said he had a fight on his hands because these things were trying to jump into him to get him to drink. His girlfriend was alcoholic, and he said he watched these spirits escort her into traffic in front of a truck, and she got hit and killed while she was drunk. And he said he could see the spirits that guided her in front of that truck. So what he maintained is that the cravings that you feel, or alcoholics feel, is not just a physiological thing. It's these things wanting more alcohol. So, you know, you can go, you know, one drink is not enough, and a million you know, one is too many, and a million's not enough. So they will get in there and they will just drink until the guy passes out. And the more he drinks, the more enter and the more control they have over him. So if what this guy is saying is the truth, it's not just the patient or the victim drinking, it's also these dark spirits who can't get drunk any other way than possess their bodies. So, I would tell that story to alcoholics who would come into the emergency room when I was working psych there and tell them, okay, those thoughts for you to drink, if this story is true, those thoughts telling you to drink are not your thoughts. They're coming from these things. And a lot of them went, well, you're right. You're right. I don't want to drink. And, I feel compelled to. So once they realize that there's an outside force, at least in part, and probably to a big part, driving their drinking, and that's why they call spirits, I guess, is that now it's not them who's totally at fault. They have an opponent who is an enemy that is trying to get them to drink. And that makes a big difference in how much blame they attribute to themselves and how much guilt that produces, which maintains their drinking. So at least they have a fighting chance if they know there's an outside force that are putting those thoughts in their head, telling them to drink. Let me see what else. Yeah, so that goes hand in hand with your drinking story. And with alcohol, the withdrawal effect, for every ounce you drink, there's a 12-hour withdrawal, and it just keeps mounting. So if you drink a 6-pack, it's 12 hours, times 6. And that's how many hours before your body recovers, and it just keeps building until you can go into alcoholic psychosis or DTs, which is basically, you're crazy, you're bouncing off the walls. So any drinkers out there that are having a hard time with that stuff, you might want to think about that. Any comments, James, or any questions?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments, because I've seen the malign effects of alcohol on people that I was sure were hearing voices, because they would argue with themselves. They would like snap and kind of like get angry, as if like some kind of negative thought came into their head and they were trying to dispel it or banish it, or internally arguing with it or something. And a lot of times they would kind of, for lack of a better term, phase out, where they're with you one moment, and then the next you look at them and they're kind of spacing out, looking off into the distance, or turned inwards, and they're like in their own little headspace, their own little world. And with the benefit of hindsight, I can see now that it's this internal thing going on, this internal dialogue with whatever these entities are. And also a point you made earlier, Jerry, about how these entities strive to isolate us. They strive to turn us against those that are part of our support system, by pushing all these negative thoughts in our heads to engender mistrust and suspicion upon other people. And I couldn't help thinking, Jerry, about all the people out there that I was pretty sure to begin with were entity infested, but these particular people were incorrigible gossips, where they were constantly talking about other people. And I couldn't understand. It's like, why don't they talk about the weather? Why don't they say good things about other people? Why not just not talk about other people at all? And of course, you find out down the track that they're talking about you, of course, because you're a person, right? They'll talk to me about these other people, and it's what they always say about gossips, where if they're always gossiping to you about other people, what are they saying behind your back? And I've experienced that firsthand, Jerry. And now, from what you told me, it's these intrusive thoughts that are just constantly pecking away at them. James is this, Sally is that, Jerry is this, Jerry did this, Jerry's talking about you behind your back. And they can't help but verbalize these intrusive thoughts because, like you pointed out, key point, folks, these intrusive thoughts are in our own thought voice. They sound like our own thoughts. So our de facto default setting is we're the ones thinking up all these things. But now it becomes crystal clear these people, and in the old days, Jerry, they had a term in some traditional societies in Europe, the spirit of accusation, where there would be a certain person in a village or a town that all they did was make accusations against other people, gossip about other people. And I think this is where it comes from, this spirit of accusation, Jerry. And, you know, the point you made about how the intrusive thoughts strive to drive people away from their support system, there you go.
Well, you're absolutely right there. Now, the Christian mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who wrote the book Heaven or Hell, he talked about these spirits some 700 years ago and how they operated. And the first psychologist that I know of who realized what he was talking about was a fellow named Wilson Van Dusen, who wrote The Presence of Other Worlds, which was published by the Swedenborg Society. And he documented a number of cases where he was speaking to the voices of his patients. So unlike myself, who always knew that they were rotten things that needed to be destroyed, he would bring his patients in and say, well, no guarantees, but you know, I'd like to learn about your voices and hear what they have to say. And he would strike up conversations with the voices to try to find out about them. At one point he gave, so I worked with him 2 years before his death. We were trying to get a book written when cancer took him over. But during that time, he told me some interesting tales. He said on one patient, he got both the patient and the voices to agree to take both a Rorschach and an MMPI, you know, which both had psychotic scales on them. And he gave those tests to the patient independently of the voices, and you know, told the voices, you just answer what you think, and the patient answer what you think, and don't listen to the voices. The voices were more psychotic than the patient himself, he said, which I found interesting. So you know, he carried on, you know, hundreds of conversations with the voices and found that they didn't know anything more than the patient carried in their own memory. He said there was one voice who insisted he was an engineer, but he didn't know any more mathematics than the patient herself, you know. So, you know, that was interesting. And one thing Sherry found out about them, and you know, I learned too, is that they're consummate liars. They will tell you, the patient, any lie that will upset them. And when they get them really unbalanced, they will tell them they've done really bad things and insist that they did those things. And the patient's kind of wondering whether they actually did do those things, but they can't tell anybody or ask anybody if they did those things, because then they think they were crazy. So it was like a big circle.
It's like a form of internal gaslighting, Jerry. And when I think about, and it may seem like we're kind of diverging, folks, but I think it's germane to the conversation, because we all know what narcissistic behavior is like, narcissistic behavior. We all know what it's like to be gaslighted by somebody, some narcissist who is a pathological liar. You see them do something a moment ago right in front of you, and then when you point it out to them, they say, no, I didn't do that, when you know you saw them do something, right? That's just an example in which I've experienced personally. And the more I think about it, I would say that people like that, these voices, these intrusive thoughts, and these malign entities have so comfortably merged with these people, Jerry, that it's just part of their being. They've become so integrated with these intrusive thoughts, with these negative entities, that the entities work through them, speak through them, strive to manipulate, narcissistically confuse and confound others, because that's what its shtick is, right? It's like they try to put their distorted reality upon us, put their crazy interpretation of reality upon us, and then make it look like we're the whack jobs. And and I see that all the time, because in this particular field we're in, Jerry, there's so many fantasy-prone individuals. There's so many narcissists. There's so many people with, grandiose personalities, constantly big-noting themselves. And now what you're telling me just reinforces my previously held belief that these are just entity-infested people, that they just can't help verbalize all these things that keep, streaming into their minds.
Yeah, one thing I saw that was interesting while working in the prison is, they would catch an inmate doing something red-handed. I mean, they had him, and he would just continue to make up a lie and maintain that lie and stuck by that lie until the officers believed it and he got away. I've seen that happen over and over and over again.
It's almost like they expect, like, people just throw in the towel. Okay, you win. You believe it.
It's either, okay, we don't have enough to, or we sort of believe it, or this could have been the case. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt when they shouldn't have, over and over again. But what Swedenborg said some 700 years ago, he said that all thoughts, none of our thoughts belong to us. And that one thing that I've seen, and Sherry has seen and has developed a program to combat, was that any negative thought about yourself that comes into your mind is put there by them, and it's a lie. So one of the things she did Sherry's my she's my what do you call it, buddy in arms here. I mean, I've met her 15 years ago. I know that she was one of the most brilliant people I knew, and I met her while she had the biggest prison reform website in the country, and I was advising her on how to make the Alabama prison system sweat, because I couldn't do it to my own prison system without getting fired. And she did a pretty good job of that. But after that, through the years, we've kind of always kept touch. And one day I had an interesting case, a psychotic inmate, and I started telling her about that, and she goes, "Oh, I know all about these things. I know all about the voices." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And she said, "Well, I had to deal with them myself when I was a young woman, and then I had to fight them for years before I figured out a way to get rid of them." And I'd known her for like 15 years before she said this. She was an accomplished engineer. Her memory is twice as sharp as mine is. She's very well organized. She was dealing with multi-million-dollar, construction projects. And she's one of the most spiritually advanced people I knew. And here she is telling me that as a young woman, she was hearing voices, and that she found her own way to get rid of them. So we started comparing notes. And first of all, I didn't quite believe her. So I started asking her, hammering her with questions that nobody would know the answers to unless they had actually dealt with these voices. And she just bam, 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 right down the line. She knew all those things. So I'm like, holy cow. So from that point on, we just, when I ran into an interesting case that puzzled me, I'd call her up and go, "Hey, I'm seeing this. What the devil's going on?" And she would either not know, or she'd give me information from her perspective. So it was kind of like we just kind of linked up and been working together ever since then. But one of the programs she found, and I tested on the front lines, that works. I mean, it's not enough in and of itself most of the time, but it's a pretty powerful tool, is if the patient can get to the point where they can recognize who they are from the voices and the lies the voices are telling them, they can apply this program, which is basically, like I told you, any negative thought that comes into your head is put there by these entities, and they try to get it to fester. So she would cut that off right away and automatically say, "That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie." So if you counter that enough times, the amount of upset that they can trigger because you're not buying into their lies starts to greatly diminish. So it's a very powerful tool that that I've put to use in the prison. That I kind of knew basically how it worked, but boy, she really compacted it and put it into a very concise form that it's very usable. So it's not like schizophrenics are the only ones that hear these things. We all do, all of us. Again, every negative thought that comes into your mind is put there by them. The more they can upset you, what they're after is the generation of negative emotional energy, which is what they feed off of. Now, for years, I suspected, I saw an energy drop in the schizophrenics who I worked with, who were telling me consistently, different ones in different units, even in different states. After the voices hit them, their energy level dropped to virtually zero. They couldn't even get out of bed. They couldn't function. They were so drained of energy that they told me it was like working out in the hot sun all day with a pickaxe, digging pits, and they were just completely drained. And there was a one-to-one correspondence between the appearance of the voices and their energy disappearing. Now, for years, I thought that was because of the massive amount of anxiety that these things generate, because they tell them all kinds of god-awful things. And here's these things, they're telling you you're worthless, you're no good, kill yourself. Anything that they can to generate that negative emotional energy, and then they take it. But I attributed that for years to the very high anxiety state that these things generate when they're attacking. And sometimes it's not just one or two of them, it's a whole herd of them. Like some people have hundreds of them in their heads. And when all those attack at once, it's like, unbearable.
It's like a flash mob in intrusive thought terms, where it's all getting up on you at one moment.
A very violent one, a very verbally violent one. So for years, I thought it was the anxiety that those attacks caused and what these voices were saying. One day, when I was assigned to the jail for the prison, central detention unit, so all that changed. That the anxiety hypothesis just blew apart. At about the same time, I got an inmate letter from the roommate of a psychotic his roommate was psychotic, was paranoid schizophrenic. And this guy who wrote the letter asking me for help had snitched off the gangsters in the prison, and they were trying to kill him. They'd already stabbed him once. He was in the CDU for protective custody. They wanted him dead so bad because they lost so much on the guards took all their drugs and sent all these gangsters to higher custody units, and they were like a bunch of Africanized bees, man. They wanted this guy dead. They wanted him dead so bad they sent some of their members, they purposely got in trouble so they could be sent to the CDU so they would have an opportunity to kill this guy. And they'd already stabbed him once. And I don't know how they do this, but they have these strings that they've put a message on the end of, and they can throw it under their door that it goes all the way across the floor and under the door of a cell 40 feet away, 30 feet away. And then when they yank it, it leaves that message in the door. And then you just see that string just disappear back across the floor again. And I saw it once, it's like, holy cow, how the devil did they do that? So they were sending this guy who snitched him off all these messages, your time is limited, we're right here, I'm in cell, we're going to get you, it's only a matter of time. You couldn't be under much more stress than this guy. He's got a psychotic roommate. He wakes up 3 a.m, and here's a psychotic guy standing over him, staring at him in the dark, just standing there staring at him. And he looks up at this crazy guy, and he's like, whoa, So I get an inmate letter from him saying, hey, you got to get me out of here. And at the same time, I get a letter from the captain of the jail, the CDU, saying, you know, we got this psychotic guy over here who's causing some problems with his roommate. You need to do something about this. And they were both in the same cell. So you couldn't have a better experimental situation. Everything was equal. You know, their environment was equal. The things they did were equal. Their schedule was equal. Everything was equal because they were in the same cell.
Well, Jerry, hold that thought, because we've reached the end of the first segment, and I think it's a good time to take a break and segue into that in the second segment, because folks, we're just getting started, and Jerry is sharing a lot of personal anecdotes and things that he has confirmed, verified to his own satisfaction, having been immersed in this kind of environment where it's like a living laboratory, literally, with all these people that are paranoid, schizophrenic, and in this context, in the extremely hostile environment of the prison correctional system. So Jerry's website, Jerry, do you want to tell the website that you and Sherry share together? Yeah, we've had Sherry on the show. We'll have her back again, by the way, folks.
Yeah, Sherry has a website where one section is dedicated to this kind of stuff. It's keyholejourney.com. Under the paranormal section. There are letters that are written by people who've experienced these things. There's papers I've written. There's videos, a whole section of videos on this stuff. And then I've got a Facebook page. It's called the Presence of Other Worlds and Schizophrenia, I believe I called it, or Paranoid Schizophrenia. I've got a YouTube page, but I'm struggling to try to figure out how to work that thing, and it's not in good shape. But Sherry's got all the videos on her website. Under the paranormal section, there's videos, there's papers. And again, that's keyholejourney.com under the paranormal section.
And we'll have all that information on our website and our YouTube channel. For our dear listeners out there, if you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to the CosmicSwitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.